Okay, so in this video, I'm going to walk you through this thing called the ego. Now, we have simplified the presentation and delivery of this mind concept that is the ego, or the construct, or the occupant, or parts that we notice arise in mind and in the thinking mind. So whilst you may potentially have come across much more comprehensive versions of descriptions of the ego, maybe some of Freud's work, we have simplified this to keep it as easy and simple because we don't need to overdo it here either. So let's get going. So what is the ego? When we say ego or the construct, what is it? What are we meaning by that? Just taking a moment to see what arises for you and how would you answer this if you were to spend 20 seconds answering it. Well, the ego is maybe quickly writing that down. Press pause. As you come back, moving along, the ego, put simply, is the incessant storyteller. It is that which is constantly narrating in the thinking mind, narrating about reality and the world that is happening out there. Just notice if there was a you with a body and eyeballs that was perceiving the world and seeing the world, but there was no narrator, then it would be relatively quiet and you would see the shape of something that we might call a tree without even necessarily calling it a tree. Yeah. It is also the part of mind that creates this unique, but sometimes and often, mostly often, not so useful sense of self and other. Now that might seem beautiful. There's a self and there's another, and we get to come together. How beautiful. But also what comes with this is this sense of separation between here and there. And the ego is the only part of the mind that actually creates that sense of separateness. If you had the entire cosmos, you had the entire world, let's just say Earth, and this part of the human mind and prefrontal cortex was not present, was not there, the world as it is, as it stands, would be completely void of any separation. It would be that woo-woo thing that hippies tend to speak to of oneness. And in a very practical third upper right quadrant objective perspective of this is, well, there isn't actually separation between this and the laptop here because there's a particle here that's in touch with the air particle there, in touch with another air particle, in touch with another air particle, in touch with another air particle, which eventually ends up touching this laptop there, which means if we were to paint all of these particles in between, it would look like there's actually no space between. So just knowing that this sense of other, this separateness gets created here. It's prefrontal cortex. And so to become cognizant of the pitfalls of the language habit, as well as its tremendous gift to humanity, is a unique feature of the most advanced ego stages. Now, what is this statement speaking to? Essentially, language is this double bind. Yeah, it is so powerful. If we use language with intentionality, it is so powerful as a tool. Yet, it is also the piece that has created a sense of separateness from the very beginning of language, where there may have been a cave or a rock wall, and someone, one of our species, drew a symbol on the wall. And as they drew this symbol equaled that. This is that. This word as symbol equals tree. That shape we see out there that has these things in the shape of leaves, that is the color that we call green. This is that creates that sense of separation. And that's its downfall. But if we can skillfully use language, then we can use it to positively influence our own selves and the world around us. So some common narratives that the ego or construct or these parts that come up, common narratives that it might come up with are a sense of not being good enough. Like, you couldn't possibly do that. Being frustrated or resistant or angry. Yeah, having thoughts of anger, or like, I don't want to do that, or why is that happening again? Or a judgment of like, of that person there and how they're doing something, how they're saying something, or why they might be saying something, or a fear of judgment. Your perspective obviously being the right one. Have you experienced that for yourself? Like, well, how can you not get it? I'm seeing it this, how can you possibly not get it? I don't understand. Guilty, already knowing the outcome, right? How often do we even engage in a course, for example, and we have this sense that we already know what's going to be delivered? What could this possibly teach me? Whether it's a course or a situation in life, what could it possibly teach me? Well, that's coming from a place of, I already know it all. Stress, overwhelm, or anxiousness. Yeah. A sense of worrying about what others may think or how they might feel if I say or do this. There's a healthy level of discernment around this, and then also a not so healthy version. And worrying is never healthy, but having a healthy level of consideration of the other as we say, how we say something. Therefore, we want to bring our responsibility into and being about how I show up, how I say things, how I deliver things, how I do things. Because if that's done with integrity, yeah, and a radical responsibility, then and an intention, an intention that is true, yeah, then that is not or unlikely to hurt anyone. It may be uncomfortable for someone to hear or to deal with, but it's not going to hurt anyone. It's only our thoughts about what's been said that can have that impact in here. And then the feeling the need to constantly be doing something. Chronic busyness is what business can often end up being, unless it's super aligned and we're in the right phase of the cycle of the business where we're doing, but we're being in the doing, and then there's an opportunity for restfulness, and it's all sweet. But this sense of a need to constantly be doing something, because if I'm not, there's a level of guilt going on and a restlessness, and I'm not comfortable, and like, what's here if I'm not doing anything? Yeah. Who has experienced? These are common narratives of the mind. Now, it's really important that as we speak to these narratives, as we speak to these parts that come up in us, they are there because they were once useful, and or they might simply be trying to protect us here from something that we might not need protecting from. Yeah, many of these are derived from a drive to stay in a sense of comfort and the known, which is what the ego delves in. Comfort and the known. Keep me there. That was really useful. Back in the day when we were trying to create a home and survive, we needed to know our environment and have a decent level of comfort so that we can actually get a restful night's sleep. And that really impacted our capacity to survive based on what we needed to do the next day in terms of either move space again or hunt or gather or whatever that was. The way we're living these days, all of that's already there and not actually at threat a lot of the time. But we have this lived experience that it might be. And so it's just to bring awareness to that and see it for what it is. And we don't need to disassociate from it, but we can disidentify from it and not identify as it anymore. So the biggest problem we all face is the story that we tell ourselves of what our lives have been. That story is keeping us in a box of the have been. The cubicle you're really living in is your story. So either bring awareness to that and shift that story and allow the story to be more reflective of what's actual right now. Yeah, what's actually true about right now, or drop the story altogether and simply start to engage with life in a way where you're engaging with what is being presented here and meeting the task required as best as you possibly can, breaking it down into smaller tasks and meeting that first little task. Great, let's move that into another task. Everything can be broken down to a step that is possible by you right now, whatever that step may be for you uniquely and individually. And so what now? Egolessness does not mean, so without the ego, does not mean the absence of a functional self. A lot of people like, oh, how would I survive with my ego? Well, if you're surrounded by tigers, maybe, but like even then, the absence of the ego does not mean the absence of a functional you, functional self. That's a psychotic stage, not a sage. It means that one is no longer exclusively identified with that self. So we're not being had by the parts, but they're playing their role. We're able to see them for what they are, and we're not being had by them when it is not serving us or the situation at hand and is not the most appropriate, healthy, or useful response in that moment. Think about relationships, think about business, think about your own body, think about your own mind, your own practices that serve all of those things. Is it the most useful, healthy, or appropriate response you can come up with in the moment, given the stimulus and context there? So, simplifying this piece, I want you to consider, have you heard a voice go off in mind before? What's your answer there? Oh, how many voices have you heard? Just the one or a few? Because we might send additional invoices to all of the voices, depending on how many of you there are. And so I want you to think of a time where you had experienced judgment of something out there or someone out there, or even yourself. Think of a specific moment, maybe in the last few days. Got one? Cool. Now that initial judgment of that thing, of yourself, the judging, is what we call the ego. Judging that out there. That's that initial voice that comes online, the initial part that comes online when there's judging happening. Then I've kind of Can I get backwards? Then, have you noticed a second voice come in that's judging the judging? So thinking of that moment, that scenario, that context, there's the initial judging, and then there's this second voice that comes in. And it's kind of like, what are you doing, man? Who are you to judge that, judge them? Like, why are you being so harsh on yourself? Or why are you being an asshole for? Notice the judging of the judging. That's this piece here. In this piece here, the judging of the judging, the experience of that tends to be much greater than this initial judging. We call this the super ego. It tends to take an authoritarian voice, or the voice of someone that is an authority in your life. Teacher, partner, parent, boss, coach. And all of that is all well and good. But we really want to be able to discern and start to lean on this being the authority as to what is true here for me. What is the most useful, appropriate, and healthy way to respond here in this moment? Just noticing that, okay, well, what part of that is true and what part isn't? But when that judging of the judgment comes in, that actually feels much worse. And it's really easy for us to identify as that part, even for those that have done much of the spiritual work. It's like, oh yeah, I can see the voices of mind. Whilst there's all of this commentary about the voices of mind. And so what's really curious to inquire around is, got the first voice, judging, then there's the judging of the judging. What about the space where there's an awareness of the judging of the judging? Is there anything happening there? Any noise? In this space, sitting just behind all of the parts, all of the noises, all of the, maybe not even noises, but the voices, yeah? This is the deeper sense of me, silently witnessing, observing, aware of, witness to what is arising in this space as a part of mind, as a part of thought. Noticing the judging and then noticing the judging of the judging. That part is the deeper sense of you, and there isn't any noise or chit-chatter happening there. It is the part that has been present to all that has come and gone from parts of the thinking mind to the entire body here and all of the forms it's taken, to every relationship and every form that it's taken and transmuted into and out of, to every single business that you've been a part of, role that you've taken up and then no longer had. Everything that has shifted and come and gone, and everything has shifted and come and gone, except for one. And that is you as awareness, as the observer, as witness to these parts coming and going. That couldn't possibly judge. And so seeing if you can start to rest half a step back into this place here without a need to even change the parts, change the ego and the narratives that are playing out, but simply just starting to see those and not see those as those, not identifying as those, but seeing them for what they are, discerning, receiving the usefulness, and also where it's not true, letting that go. You don't have to push anything away. Just see it for what it is. Coming into this work, a lot of people feel that they're going to have peace of mind. And yes, you can have peace of mind. You can have peace of mind that is always available back here, even if observing the show. When you're at the theater or cinema and you're sitting there observing peacefully all that is going on stage, is it possible to do so with you being in a peaceful state as you watch what's happening on stage? Unless you get caught up in it, there's a beauty in that. But if we stay caught up in it, there's not so beautiful anymore. Doesn't feel so great, does it? And so realizing the peace is back here, and it doesn't require for a complete Buddha-like state and emptiness of mind. It simply requires us to see parts of mind for what they are, all parts of mind for what they are, and not identifying as those. When we identify as those, that's where we start to use the word I a fair bit. Yeah. Most of the time, if you're using the word I, then we are identifying. It is the idea of who I am and who I take others to take me to be is our identity. It's an idea of me. And your mother has a different idea of you than your father, and your son or cousin or peer, colleague have a different idea of you than you do of you, than each of them do of you. And so which one are you? Neither, really. You are that which is aware of all of that playing out. You could answer you are all of those. Not very true. It's true that there's a perception of you by them. That's true. Yes, all of that's true. But you are not that. Yeah. And so noticing where these parts that have been constructed in mind to serve you, to protect you from experiencing too much fear or too much pain, a lot of the time in the first 8 years, give or take, of your life, where you didn't have the skillful means to otherwise to not experience too much pain or fear that would then overload your nervous system, it was safer actually to construct these and keep you safe to take particular actions. They just might not be serving you anymore, which is why we might be experiencing frustration, anger, shame, guilt, a whole bunch of pieces. Yeah. And so really just starting the practice of seeing these parts for what they are, and in doing so, we become less had by them, and resting more and more into the spaciousness of your being, the deeper sense of your me, rather than I, deeper sense of your me. You don't need to try and get rid of anything. Let's get rid of the ego. Let's get rid of the thoughts. All of that energy is just feeding it. Just gently letting the work be you being able to be sitting back here in the face of that playing out, and in the face of any discomfort that arises in body as a result of that playing out in mind. Some key signs of the ego constructing. So actually the ego as a word is quite stagnant and static, kind of gives us the perception that there's a little dude sitting there, or dudette sitting there in our prefrontal cortex, pulling all of the levers. Yeah, it's ego constructing. It's a process that is playing out and not always at play. So when we say I'm angry, that's quite stagnant. I am angry. Angry is what I am. Well, there are moments that you're not angry. Simply put, there are moments that you're not angry. So that is a false statement already. It is in process whilst it's processing, and then no longer processing. So signs of the ego, if you notice blame, pointing out there, sense of other, blaming the thing out there, resistance to this thing, again, self and other, separation, ego. And when we say ego, we can start to lighten, it's the construct, the occupant, the thing occupying the space in mind. There's a lot of negative connotations with it, and we don't need to carry those into the space. defensiveness, defending from that. Sometimes useful, yeah, but you'll notice when it's not useful. Superior, well, you need to defend yourself from a knife coming at you. Yeah, it's a really obvious example. Superiority is what, when we think of the ego being better than another, that's quite a typical one. One that's not so typical is inferiority. And often we are looking to be superior over another because we're momentarily feeling inferior to that other. So it is a polarity and a bind there, and both alive simultaneously. And then an anger at, frustration at, annoyance with, all separation and states of ego. And we just want to allow for healthy processing of that and to let those parts be seen, be heard, because they weren't able to be heard earlier on in life, and to then allow us to be with that, which will allow for a healthier processing and a healthier natural regulation of the nervous system, allowing the nervous system to do what it naturally does. More on this in the nervous system module. For now, starting to journal and notice the narratives that you are finding and noticing in mind, yeah, and how is that being represented somatically in body.